ancient Greece rings of affluence and prestige. As Americans, we greatly value all that Greece brought to us from a philosophical, literary, and economic perspective. From the Greeks, we obtained the first remnants of mathematical and scientific thought, but we also gained the notion that slavery is a necessary evil. Although Greece is notorious for its influence on Western art, philosophy, and architecture, its focus on slavery laid the foundation for the institution in the 19th century. Slavery, however, allowed the Greeks to make the advances that have so influenced Western culture and the very fabric of daily life in the modern age. While slavery is not often associated with ancient Greece, it was a very common practice. It is estimated that the majority of Athenian citizens owned at least one slave. Because of the large role that slaves had in the Greek economy, most ancient writers consider slavery not only natural, but necessary. This idea, however, was questioned by the Greek philosopher Socrates. The importance of slavery within Greek civilization cannot be understated. It allowed the Greeks to set the precedent in education and critical thinking, enabling them to ponder their existence without the influence of a mystical force, such as a deity.
The origins of slavery are quite fascinating. The Greeks understood the importance of intellectual thought and knowledge, and thus realized that they could not simply have their brightest citizens engaging in tedious affairs, such as farming. Slaves were primarily the result of military conquest or defense by Greek forces. According to Homer's version of Justice in the Polis, many slaves were war captives. Pirates or raiders seized others in the rough regions to the north and east of Greek territory.
Once victorious in battle, the victor would gather citizens of the opposing side. These individuals would be transported back to Greece, where they were purchased by the most affluent members of Greek society, as affluent members needed educated slaves to educate their children. The role of the slave was largely dependent on the desire of his master. In fact, some of the most common positions that the slaves had were teachers, doctors, nurses, construction workers, policemen, hairdressers, mail carriers, cooks, nannies, bakers, miners, dancers, musicians, craftspeople, and accountants, yet the far majority of slaves worked in the fields.
The primary role of slaves within the economy was to assist in the field of agriculture, the backbone of the Greek economy. Most landowners, however, only possessed a few slaves, for large acquisitions of a large number of slaves to work in the field would have been uneconomical. Slaves who did not work in the fields participated in a variety of jobs. In the household, slaves cleaned.
Slave, this mantle needs to be dusted.
Yes, master.
Faster! Faster!
Sorry, master, it's the fastest I can go. Oh, Jesus.
Cooked, fetched water.
Slave!
Yes, master.
Boil some water, I want soup!
Oh, okay.
Faster!
I'm sorry.
I want soup now!
It's heavy, sir. It's heavy.
Assisted with weaving, watched over the children, and performed other domestic duties of smaller caliber.
When not in the fields or in the household, the slave had quite a significant role within Greek society.
The role of the slave within Greece is quite fascinating. While the majority of Greek slaves attended to labor in the fields, many slaves were crucial figures in the domestic arena. Slaves were needed in order to protect the Greek city-state, and numerous amounts of them participated in the police force in ancient Athens. Furthermore, slaves made up a substantial portion of a city-state's naval force, as is demonstrated in Athens.
Because of the sheer multitude of occupations a Greek slave could possess, the rights of the ordinary slave could vary greatly.
The rights of the slave were largely dependent on one's purpose. For instance, household slaves were allowed to engage in family activities and were often viewed as family members. The life of a slave when he was a mine worker or a ship's crew member, however, was a life of misery and danger. These individuals, while not possessing any rights whatsoever, were forced to engage in grueling and considerably dangerous work that threatened their lives on a daily basis.
As a whole, the treatment of slaves in ancient Greece was far more humane than the treatment of slaves in 19th century America.
While American slaves were viewed as mere peasants,
Good evening, master.
No, you don't talk to me like that!
Stop! You hit me right in the hump. Oh, I need a cigarette.
Many Greek slaves were actually viewed as human beings. Slave, come here, please.
Yes, master.
Could I bother you for a foot massage?
Oh, no bother. Could you just hold my...
Oh, yes, of course. Oh, thank you, slave.
Oh, it's no problem, master. It's my pleasure.
Ancient slavery was a purely economic or military endeavor, and many Greek slaves were gradually allowed to gain more rights, contrary to 19th century slavery in the South. Furthermore, while Greek slavery was bred out of necessity, as city-states needed to produce a steady output of crops and were in dire need of military protection, American slavery was justified through the examination of the Bible, as Southerners used the text to establish the idea that African Americans were naturally inferior to Caucasians.
As Americans, we have traditionally greatly valued Greek ideological thought. Thus, it is plausible that in the 19th century, slavery could have been justified through a thorough examination of Greek practices.
So, Jim, I've been thinking, why do we got slavery in the first place?
'Cause the Greeks done it. As a result of Greeks using slavery as a means of agricultural production, Americans could have stated that slavery was a necessity for economic production, as it was for the Greeks. Furthermore, the Greeks display that while the concept of slavery naturally insubordinates a large portion of society, it does not justify the harsh brutality of slaves, as is shown by the somewhat kind treatment of slaves within the Greek society.
Similar to the manner in which the treatment of a slave in Greece was largely dependent on his role, the treatment of slaves within ancient Egypt was representative of their roles within society.
While slaves of highly respected and wealthy individuals were often treated far better than peasants of neighboring societies, agrarian laborers were forced to engage in backbreaking work. Because of the rigorous labor slaves participated in, the life expectancy for them in comparison to slaves of Athens was far lower.
While many Greek slaves were afforded the opportunity to become contributing members of society, the same cannot be said for the Helots. The Helots, who were subjugated peoples that formed the main population of Sparta, had no rights whatsoever and were used as mere pawns to reinforce the idea of Spartan valor.
Much like Helots, Egyptian laborers were constantly beaten and had the potential to be sold at a moment's notice. Because of the rigorous labor slaves participated in, the life expectancy for them in comparison to slaves of Athens was far lower. Both Egyptian and Greek slavery allowed for the same emancipation of slaves, though this act was rare. In Greece, the slaves had the ability to purchase their freedom, while the act of emancipation in Egypt was through manumission, a practice deemed advantageous for the soul of the slave owner.
In modern-day culture, slavery is viewed as morally wrong because of the idea that making a whole class of individuals inferior to another naturally exploits and degrades a substantial portion of the human race. Furthermore, the notion exists that slavery is a natural violation of human rights as it strips an individual of the rights he is born with, violating the idea that all human beings are created equal. In ancient Greece, however, slavery was simply viewed as a necessary evil, one that had to exist to allow Greek society to flourish. In general, slavery in Greece was simply indicative of one's occupation, while slavery from a contemporary perspective meant natural inferiority.